Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are. A very warm welcome to today's webinar on disaster risk knowledge in the Pacific, vital information for resilient development. My name is Alexandra Galperin from the Asian Development Bank. This meeting is co-hosted by the Pacific community and by the Asian Development Bank. Today's session is the public opening event for a series of 3P learning sessions on generating, communicating, and using climate and disaster risk information for governments and other users of risk information in the Pacific. In today's session, you will get a taste of what is to come, and we will highlight regional views of the importance of up-to-date and locally specific risk information reflecting recent experience in the Republic of the Marshall Islands, in Samoa, the Solomon Islands, and the Kingdom of Tonga. So the opening remarks will be given by Ms. Lea Gutierrez from the Asian Development Bank and by Paula Vibili from the Deputy Director General for Science and Capability from the SPC. This will be followed by a keynote speech by Dr. Melchior Mataki, the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Environment, Climate Change, Disaster Management and Meteorology from the Solomon Islands. And this will be followed by a panel discussion. I'll introduce the panelists later. So before proceeding with the agenda, let's do a quick poll to get an insight of what brings you here today and what are your interests in the series. So let me read out the options that we have here. The first question, the first option is, what are you most interested in learning from the series is the question. First option is an overview of what disaster risk information exists in the Pacific region. We have then recent disaster risk assessments, innovations, and lessons learned. Third option is how results from disaster risk assessments are used. The next option is efforts to capture climate change impact in the Pacific. And finally, efforts to involve communities in risk assessments and to capture their perspectives. So we are now at 58%. We're making very rapid progress here with the poll. 70%, 77. Okay, there's a little bit of back and forth here. 82%, it's a very close race, as far as I can tell. The winner seems to be interest in recent disaster risk assessments, innovations, and lessons learned. Closely followed by efforts to involve communities in risk assessments and to capture their perspectives. And again, very close is how results from disaster risk assessments are used. We will certainly hear about the first and preferred option, recent disaster risk assessments, innovations, and lessons learned today, as well as efforts to capture climate change impact in the Pacific. Some of the other topics will be coming up later in the series, and please stay by to learn about that. But now, and without further ado, let me please ask Lea Gutierrez, the Director General of the Pacific Regional Department, to share her opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to all the colleagues in the panel and colleagues from all over the world. So ADB is delighted to host the Pacific Risk Knowledge Series together with SPC. The series seeks to build an understanding of how climate and disaster risk information can support resilience through disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation in Pacific Island communities. The series will showcase regional perspectives and expertise on climate and disaster risk by bringing together actors involved in producing and applying Pacific disaster risk knowledge. Such knowledge is vital for achieving ADB's strategic objective for the region, which is supporting our Pacific developing member countries to 1, prepare for and respond to shocks and stresses, 2, deliver sustainable services, and 3, promote inclusive growth. In the Pacific, enhancing resilience, sustainability, and inclusion needs to build upon an understanding of 1, key hazards and threats, 2, the vulnerability of people and their assets, and 3, how they may be impacted by climate change and disasters. Robust knowledge of risks allows countries to steer both policies and investments to promote resilience and adaptation and guide growth in such a way that it promotes the well-being of all, including vulnerable groups that can otherwise get caught in the downward spirals of increasing destitution. In the Pacific, ADB started promoting multi-hazard disaster risk assessments in 2020 and concluded its first assessment in Tonga last year, focusing on the capital Nuku'alofa. Tonga's risk assessment will inform the design of an adaptation plan for a wider urban resilient sector program. Similar initiatives are underway in the Cook Islands and in Vanuatu. ADB is also engaging with counterpart governments to develop additional assessments in neighboring countries. There is a range of us actors working in this field, and we recognize the need to share the knowledge we are all gaining, learn from associated challenges, and optimize the use of risk knowledge for the benefit of our Pacific Island communities. This is our main reason for initiating the present series together with the SPC. In this first session, we will hear from 4 regional leaders in this field. They will share their views on the benefits of risk knowledge and their experiences in generating and applying risk information in the Republic of Marshall Islands, Samoa, Solomon Islands, and Tonga. So with this, I pause for now and I hand it over to you, Alexandra. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, DG Leah, for your great points. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Paula Vivili from the Pacific community to open this event. Dr. Paula, please.
Excellencies, distinguished speakers and panelists, Ms. Gutierrez, ladies and gentlemen. Bula vinaka and welcome to the inaugural events of the Pacific Disaster Risk Knowledge Series. Many of us have just about gone hoarse from repeatedly saying that Pacific Island countries and territories are most vulnerable to the impacts of disasters and climate change. It could be said that some are even tired of hearing us say that time and again, and again, and again. But it is like a badge that we wear with pride and some sadness because it is the truth. But stating this fact again and again and again will get us nowhere. A lot of effort has been put into addressing many of these challenges. And while we still have a long way to go, it is always helpful to stop and see where we've come from and where we're going. This is why it's great we're coming together today to talk about what each of the countries are doing to strengthen our resilience to climate change and disasters, as these achievements are significant and are making a difference. The Pacific Risk Knowledge Series, and in particular this event, showcases countries who have invested time and resources in thinking and better understanding the risks posed by climate change and disasters, and how to best align those with current and future investments. These countries have used this information to tailor and test a suite of integrated actions and investments to reduce existing and prevent new risks associated with disasters and climate change. risks to the people, infrastructure investments, the economy, and the environment. In the last 2 years, the COVID-19 pandemic, tropical cyclones, floods, and more recently, the events related to Hunga Tonga, Hunga Ha'apai, have emphasized our need to be better informed, better prepared, ready to act, and to determine where and how best to invest resources. So how does an organization like the Pacific Community SPC contribute to this work? We do this through the work of our scientific and technical divisions, who, with partners and our membership, generate fit-for-purpose risk information that is used to inform investments in risk financing, resilient infrastructure, early warning, and preparedness, to name a few. Through this work, we have been able to demonstrate the value of reliable and accessible science-based information with an emphasis on people-centered approaches to inform investments by countries. The intention of our efforts is to augment and offer synergy to the great initiatives of our members and other partners. I hope that this event generates interest to share learning as well as opportunities for collaboration between countries and partners that could develop and strengthen existing communities of good practice. Minaka Wakalevdo, the ADB, for organizing and co-hosting the series, a much needed platform for us to learn from each other, from countries, implementing agencies, and development partners. We very much look forward to the input from our esteemed speakers and panelists, and to continuing the good collaborations with all of you going forward. Malo opito.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vivili, for these opening remarks and very concise statements on the importance of risk information in the Pacific. Next, it is my really great pleasure to introduce and invite our keynote speaker, Dr. Melchior Mataki, from the Solomon Islands, to share his thoughts on the value of risk information for resilient development and climate change adaptation in the Pacific. Dr. Mataki, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexandra, and good morning, good afternoon to colleagues that are joining in this session. I'd prefer to turn off my video link just to ensure that I can maintain this internet link. So fortunately, I'll have to turn off the video link. But I think firstly, I think I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation for me to say a few thoughts on this. And I think before doing that, I'd like to also acknowledge the panelists and fellow presenters from around the region, and of course our colleagues who are joining us from around the globe as well. But I think to start off my presentation, I'd like to just perhaps reiterate some things. And I noted that Deputy Director General from SPC spoke about the fact that we get to repeat ourselves at times, but that just goes on to demonstrate the importance of the issues that we are talking about here today. We all know that the Pacific region is defined by islands. That is a defining factor for the Pacific region. It's islands that are in a vast ocean space, of course, with a lot of different features, high biodiversity, unique cultures, and high vulnerability to geohazards, hydrometeorological extremes, man-made disasters, and a high susceptibility to global economic, political, environmental, and security trends. So this is the kind of region that we are in. Now, whilst I may, to some extent, emphasize our uniqueness, our high vulnerability and whatnot, and susceptibility to global trends, I think I must also say that I think over time, our people have also developed resilience to live and cope with what our natural environments and, of course, our cultures have helped us to cope with that. Now, one defining feature of our culture, of most cultures in the Pacific, is the lack of a written form of our languages. I stand to be corrected, but I am not aware of one of a cultural grouping that has got its own alphabet, for example. Now, this is very important when you look at the tail end of risk information and data. So a lot of our cultures, data, information, and knowledge are verbally transmitted, taught by doing and learning. Not learning and doing and learning. Recorded and replayed through various means, including dancing, rites, arts and crafts, totems, and applied to meet our needs. This also essentially means that data and information gathering, storage, analysis, communication must also be cognizant of our cultural setting and how we go about understanding, processing information and data from culturally, because it does affect the decisions that we take, and of course, subsequently, the actions that we also take. I'm not saying here that newer information or new ways of doing things have not come into the region, but I think it is important that we also look at the background of what we are, what defines us as a people of this region and of the Pacific. So that cultural aspect, in my view, as I alluded to earlier on, is very important. As I said, from how we think about data and information, and how it could also be made available to the last mile, well, right down to the community levels, for example, or even at the individual level. We all know that risk data and information is the foundation of disaster risk management, or any, or even of climate change action, for example. And it affects decision making, and at the same time, also the actions that we take. One of the observations I've made is that if you look at different assessments and studies that have been carried out in the Pacific, or even global studies like the Global Environment Report, or even the IPCC reports, for example, there are certain references, or there are certain common limitations that are made when there are positions or assessments made by observations that have been in the Pacific. And it's all to do with limitations. And these limitations include data and information paucity, limited long-term data, data and information in formats not easily amenable for analysis, limited published data and papers, difficulty in accessing data and information even within government institutions. This is also something that we do have here in the Solomon Islands, even within the government system. Sometimes it's very difficult to even access information. So from the above limitations, one could probably say with some degree of confidence that disaster risk management and climate change decisions and actions in the region seldom have adequate empirical basis for the actions or decisions that have been taken. And this is where, which really brings in the importance of having reliable data and information for disaster resilience and climate resilience for that matter. So I think the importance of having that valid and reliable data and information to inform policies and actions is very important for the simple fact that we needed to have such information to inform action and policies. Now, in addition to that, there are also challenges with data and information that we have in these sectors. One is the challenges relating to the credibility of the data that we have, and therefore the need for us to have validation processes and ground truthing of data of information, so that whatever information and products that come out of those are given out to decision makers and to stakeholders with the necessary and with the necessary limitations of such data, so that people take the data, but they also know what the limitations are. And if we are to, improve this within our region, how existing disaster risk knowledge can be improved within our region, I think there is a serious need to look to strengthen and develop where there are gaps, regional and national networks of government institutions, academic institutions, non-government organizations, as well as individuals to conduct research and development, gather, store, analyze data, provide outputs for stakeholders. The networks, in my view, could potentially provide the framework for cooperation and collaboration. Perhaps look into issue of open data sharing protocols, for example. As I alluded to earlier on, even here in the Solomons, we have huge difficulties accessing data, even within government institutions. So by doing so, by having these networks, that could then provide for a framework for cooperation and collaboration that should assist the sharing of data, of information and data, sharing of costs as well. Data gathering and information gathering is always a very costly exercise. And I think this is an area which also perhaps contribute to the paucity of data, the lack of long-term data, for example. It's just that the having to gather the data and gather them on continuous basis, for example, is already a very costly exercise for countries. And this would also, these networks could also be networks that could also look at providing rigorous vetting and analysis of reports, and even the production of decision support tools, for example. All these such kind of networks could really be very influential in that. Another area which I see that could also be looked into is actually the twinning of national agencies with national and regional and international agencies that are involved in data and information gathering analysis. I think we do have such arrangements in place, but perhaps they are a bit scattered all over the place, not really connected. So I'm making some kind of specific reference, for example, to the kind of relationship that our meteorological organizations have with, in the Southwest Pacific, for example, with the Solomon Islands, we do have with the Australian Bureau of Meteorology for weather data, for example, where it's stored for use by the Bureau of Meteorology. Our vastness, our vast Pacific region, even within countries as well, means that we also perhaps need to capitalize on or use geospatial and climate information and remote sensing technologies to address our geographical spread, which makes it very difficult to really go from one island to another and have that process done on a continuous basis. And I think it's very important to explore the powers of geospatial and remote sensing technologies to support data and information gathering process and even analysis as well. And you know, the list you can set of applications can go on, you know, in terms of environmental monitoring, including sources of risks, geohazards, weather, climate, and of course, creating and implementing climate adaptation and sectoral policies and programs. So at least, you know, I have shared my brief notes with the moderator. I believe that can also be shared with the others. But I think I see that in terms of improving on what we already have, I think the investments onto networks of government institutions, academic institutions, non-government organizations, and even individuals to conduct research, and using those networks as frameworks for cooperation and collaboration for open data and open data sharing and twinning of national agencies with external agencies that are also keen in data information sharing. I also have some very specific examples which I would like to touch on, but I think I'm also pressed for time. But I think the point I'd like to leave with is that we definitely need information and data to inform policies and actions. What's also important is to ensure that the products that we come up with and the way it's communicated is also cognizant of the cultural settings that we have and how we internalize knowledge for action. Because I think that's to me is also very, very important, because you can have very fancy outputs, but they are not really understood, or they are not even taken on board by decision makers and even at the individual's level. So with those remarks, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening in. And I will also be very happy to join in the rest of the discussions that will follow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mataki, for this really rich presentation. I think we're very happy that we are recording this event, because I personally would like to go back and listen to it. We'll also make sure that we share your notes with the audience, with the participants later on. Unfortunately, we're pressed for time, so we have to go ahead here. Now, with the next point in the agenda, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our three panelists. If you could bring up the slide, please, instead of highlighting me, that would be good. Three distinguished panelists who will share recent experience, first-hand experience and learnings from risk assessments and related projects and operations. Could you bring up the slide, please, and center on it? So we have Rosamund Carter-Bing, the CEO from the Ministry of Land and Natural Resources from the Kingdom of Tonga. We have Mr. Malaki Jacopo he's the Assistant Deputy Director from the Ministry. I cannot read this, I'm sorry. Could you bring this up, please? So he's from Samoa, the government of Samoa, and we have the Assistant Chief Secretary from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Mr. Catalino Kleiner. Before going into the panel discussion, I would like to ask the audience, while you're listening to this, to type any questions you might have in the Q&A space below. We will come back to these questions later on. So starting the first question, the way we'll go about this is that we'll give space to our three panelists to reflect and share some information and reflect on recent climate and disaster risk assessment in the three countries. Each panelist will be given around 5 minutes. I'll start with Catalino Kleiner, who will reflect on the significance of generating risk information on coastal hazards for islands of the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Catalino, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, let me just thank the organizer of this event, ADB and SPC, for inviting the Republic of the Marshall Islands to partake and be part of the this panel to share our experience as well as our ongoing journey in disaster knowledge sharing. So I really appreciate the invitation. So in terms of the experience of the Marshall Islands, what motivated our government to engage in going through risk assessment, that the main cause really was that the government was recognizing our need to understand more on adaptation and disaster risk reduction, and that all these information are critical to realizing our aspiration in terms of economic growth and sustainable development. So really, it's about our future. That's why we wanted to engage in having conduct assessment of our risk in terms of our coastal areas. And so it's understandable that before we can develop an approach or a plan, an assessment needs to be made. So the government needed to come up with, so we can come up with actions in order to reduce vulnerability and increase resilience across the disaster risk management spectrum. So I'm just trying to provide some information in terms of the general terms of the question that you posed, but as we go on, I'll be sharing some of the details that the Marshall Islands has gone through in terms of risk assessment. Thank you. You're on mute.
Thank you so much, Diaz Catalino, for this overview. Next, I would like to invite Mr. Malaki Jacopo from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, Samoa, to share his thoughts on the recent experience of generating information and applying risk information to improving flood risk management and early warning systems in Samoa. Malaki, the floor is yours.
Yep. Thank you very much, Alexandra. I would like to, first of all, say talo falava to everyone on this call. And I also wish to acknowledge the Director General of the SPC and ADB Pacific, as well as Dr. Meliko Mataki for that beautiful opening remarks this afternoon. It is indeed a great honor to be on this important afternoon panel with the distinguished experts from across our region. And it is also really good to see some of our colleagues from across the region joining us as well. I think for Samoa, Samoa's experience is definitely similar to other small island developing states, experiencing and living the reality of compounded impacts brought about by the natural hazards. In the last couple of decades, we have lived through more frequent intense disasters with impacts that we have not endured before, as we mentioned in the opening remarks today. But through these experiences, we have developed and enhanced our knowledge of the different disasters in terms of their impacts, the exposure and vulnerability of our communities, the underlying drivers to risks, and most importantly, the opportunities to try and reduce risks and impacts on all levels of our society. I believe there has been a great shift In the past, our small islands prioritized responding and reacting to disasters, but as our knowledge and capacity increase, we have shifted more towards risk reduction and prevention. And an integral part enabling this shift has been the increase in our national repositories and understanding of disaster risk information and knowledge. In the last 10 years, Samoa's national planning frameworks has prioritized climate and disaster resilience, and with actions calling for not only the generation, but also the effective dissemination, access to, communication, and application of disaster risk information in order for us to bring about better planning and better decision-making. And part of this has been for the planning and better decision-making on our early preparation and risk reduction, not only at the national, but also at the community levels. Ideological hazards such as destructive flash flooding has become one of the annual phenomena for Samoa, and especially in the capital, Apia, causing extensive damages and costs to the national economy and community livelihoods. Flash floods associated with Tropical Cyclone Evan in 2012 and also recent events implicated millions of damages and losses. And with Cyclone Evan itself, it implicated up to $204 million in damages and losses to Samoa's overall GDP. In the last 2 years, through climate change or green climate funding, Samoa has been piloting a flood decision support system with the support of NIWA. And this system has enabled us to generate up-to-date flood models and flood risk maps under different weather scenarios, and identifying vulnerable infrastructure, household utilities, etc., that are at risk. This system has enabled us to provide early warnings and impact information to at-risk stakeholders and inform future planning and decisions on investments and developments within vulnerable areas. This flood decision support system has been a great learning success for us, as it engages a wide range of stakeholders at different levels of implementation. At the operations level, it has improved operations and operational protocols and coordination between response agencies, while at the same time informing impact-based forecasting and warnings being communicated and received by the communities and relevant stakeholders. We are also working with ADP on a number of large infrastructural works at the moment, and part of this, of the climate and disaster risk information that's been generated for this exercise has become very valuable in informing some of those future developments. Such initiatives, as we've heard from the opening remarks, and particularly from Dr. Milika, such initiatives require a lot of technical capacity, a lot of knowledge, information pace, and resources, which are often very limited and in some instances not available in our small islands and our government's repositories. As such, we have to rely on international and regional partners for that support. And therefore, I would like to acknowledge and agree with those challenges mentioned by Dr. Milika in his keynote remarks in regards to, in most of our catchments, there's very limited and no information available so that we can derive really solid flood maps and things like that, and flood modeling. But fortunately, there are available technology, and as mentioned, these can be very costly and require a lot of capacity. As such, the collaborative efforts of our development partners, and I would like to briefly mention the Green Climate Fund, the World Bank, the European Union, ADP, and especially our regional technical institutions such as NIWA, SPRIP, the Pacific Climate Change Center, SPC, to name a few, who have been involved in this work and in all of our other hydrometeorological risk information work. They've been very helpful in bridging part of that gap. I think because we're pressing for time, I will give my interventions on how part of the results from this study has been applied to policy work for later on. But I'll move on and give the floor to Rosa to share Tonga's experience as well. And then perhaps if we have time, I'd like to talk a bit more about the policy side of things. Thank you very much, Alexandra.
Thank you, Malaki. We'll certainly come back to these interesting points. And next is, as you mentioned, Rosamond, to share experience from a recent multi-hazard disaster risk assessment in Tonga, reflecting on Tonga's needs for resilient risk information needs for resilient spatial planning and climate change adaptation of its capital, Nuku'alofa. Rosamond, please. You're on mute, Rosamond.
Apologies. Thank you very much for the opportunity and the introductions. And I think I should also acknowledge the esteemed speakers, keynote speakers and introductions for setting the scene for our presentations this afternoon. Earlier, I did pick up on two issues that I'd like to reflect on. First of all is the Dr. Paolo Vivilli's comment about repetition. I'd like to think that the more we repeat the issue, the more it echoes across the globe, and I think it's quite essential for what the Dr. Mataki had referred to in terms of resourcing. And I'll touch on those two issues later, but I'm speaking to you as, first of all, a country representative. The Kingdom of Tonga has a product, and Dr. Mataki was referring to products and services. So we have a multi-hazard disaster risk assessment report that's virtually just on 12 months old, I think, Alexandra. And I'd like to share with you what it has meant to us and what we are going to be doing with this report. I think one of the key issues on reflection is how critical political will and political support is for a product of this nature. As we all know, policymakers, decision makers rely very much on strong and sound information, data information, and advice. So this product started with the previous government, and we have a new government in place. And the resilience of the report, I must say, and I'm happy to share with you, is that the report remains relevant. Its utility to government, to policymakers, for technical officers, and in a post-disaster, in a current disaster situation, it's actually has stood the test of 12 months' time. With two governments, this current government has carried the momentum of the report. And I think what it speaks to is how important the methodology is. So with the support from ADB, we contracted a firm from overseas. And we conducted this work by remote control. And by remote means because COVID had hit, and for all of the work that we'd planned, COVID hit. So we decided we will soldier on, but we'll do it by remote control, change the dynamics. And we ended up with smaller working groups, collecting and identifying information that we had, identifying information we did not have, collecting what we could. And I think the most important part is the technical assistance and support to analyze that information and to present it in the report that's before us. Now, what are we doing with the report now is I want to share three things that we're doing with the report. First of all, we are using it with a ADB funded project, and we will be using the information in the report for a climate and disaster resilient urban development strategy and investment plan. We are in the process of identifying a firm that will work together with the government of Tonga, and this multi-hazard disaster risk assessment is very much going to be a key reference point and document for the work that we're going to be doing here in Nuku'alofa. The second one is I'm working together with Alexandra on developing a communication strategy. Previous speakers had spoken about how important it is that this information is available in a format and in a manner that is suitable to a various number of stakeholders. And most importantly, for the villages, for the people on the ground, because they are the ones who are impacted. So we're working on a communication strategy together with a community-based NGO to bring this highly technical assessment and report to the communities. And I think that's where it matters the most. And then thirdly, has been referenced earlier and referred to in the post-disaster volcanic eruption and a tsunami, what we have decided and in discussions with ADB is, as is the case with many reports, to review it, to revise it, and to report back on the impact of that recent disaster, and to recalibrate, validate the work that we've been doing. Any changes need to be done, then we're in a position to amend the report. We didn't expect that we'll be reviewing a report within 12 months, but that's the situation. I think in a nutshell, as the custodian of the information and data, and with a multi-staker approach, the report has ownership, I think, by the Tongan government. What we have discussed and what I am most passionate about with this ministry being custodian of that information and data is to ensure that it reaches the people and that the people understand it, and then that it is used in a manner where we protect our investments in our infrastructure, in our homes, in our livelihoods, and the day-to-day lives of our people. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you so much, Rosamond, for these thoughts that were also reflecting back on Dr. Mataki's contributions and his emphasis on the importance of communication, of risk results, reaching out to communities. And he also highlighted the challenges of moving from knowledge to action. So coming back to Deputy Chief Secretary Catalino, could you tell us a little bit more about what triggered the assessment in the Marshall Islands and the need to revise the National Adaptation Plan that you mentioned earlier?
Thank you again, Alexandra. So I think it started from our leaders seeing our people suffering from the effect of climate change and other disaster risk, other risks that were affecting the communities. So the government decided to carry out, as I mentioned before, this assessment to really tell the planners and the policy and decision makers of what we have to expect in the future in terms of all these risks. So currently, as we've made conversation on before, the Marshall Islands is in the process of developing its National Adaptation Plan, and we're kind of targeting it for completion by end of this year. It's kind of ambitious, kind of an ambitious goal, but that's the target now. We really wanted to have the folks understand all of these effects that will cost the livelihoods of all the peoples, their everyday lives and activities. So one of the example I can give is in the importance of knowledge sharing is how there have been some traditional I would say solutions that have always been with the people, and the goal of putting this plan together is to ensure that we also incorporate our traditional knowledge to what we understand today about the science of climate change and all these risk that comes with it. But I am really in agreement to the other panelists about the importance of having the information readily available for our planners to plan the course ahead for the country. So I also want to support the comments made by the speakers that data collection and the analysis of these data are important in helping us to develop develop a plan that can help these small island states to survive in the longer future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Catalino. A question to Malaki on the flood early warning system, and also coming back to this whole issue of involving communities. Can you tell us a little bit more about this communicating results of the assessment and some of the risk maps at the community level, so that communities would know what the threat is and how they should act as well in case of a disaster? Over to you, Malaki.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I think in terms of communicating results from these very important risk-based assessments, so there are quite various forums that we employ in order to take out the results from these studies. As mentioned by some of my colleagues, there are communication strategies in place to enable us to target a wide range of stakeholders using different communication tools and communication channels, so that even the most vulnerable are reached. So I'd just like to make mention that the importance of some of the planning community plans that are in place. We do have a disaster community management plan rollout program that's been done by a disaster management office. And this works with communities and utilize much of these risk maps, and also under the different climate and weather scenarios. And they explain these to the communities and then find out ways in order to better plan, and also to how to respond if flooding does occur. As I would also like to mention, there's a whole wide range or suite of solutions. In addition to those community level planning, there's also the ministry through the Meteorological Division also has a lot of community engagement on social medias. And we're also working very closely with the same project that to pilot a siren system, which will be able to be activated, say, for example, during the nighttime to inform the community. So all of these efforts are being informed by the climate and disaster risk information, and are being communicated to the communities as well. I think a lot of this, in order for it to be effective, we need very effective policy and governance mechanisms in place to ensure that we have a holistic approach to these issues. So, which is why very recently, last month, Samoa approved its multi-hazard and early warning system policy for hydrological and meteorological and also geological hazards. So this policy provides that overarching framework, which not only targets early warning systems, but also targets the communication of information to the vulnerable communities. And I'll just like to make a quick answer to one of the questions in the chat box as well, in regards to how the communities can be better informed and how intergovernment agencies can share data. I think as long as that enabling environment is in place with policies guiding the data sharing, and also on how to effectively communicate, such as mentioned with communication plans. As long as those policies and frameworks are in place, it will be able to effectively target our responses, not only just at the country level, but we'll also be able to target interventions from the international communities and the donor partners coming into to support the many efforts that we're trying to do at the national level. I hope that answers your question, Alexandra.
Yes, thank you so much. If I can ask Rosamond a follow-up question. Rosamond, are you there? Yes. I think we probably, everybody listening to this, to your presentation and reflections, would be quite curious to know what the recipe may be to actually generate ownership of risk assessments amongst the key stakeholder. What has been your experience? What has worked despite mostly virtual communication?
Thank you
And
very
what
much,
have you
Alexandra.
done exactly to boost that?
I think the recipe.
Rosamond, you seem to be breaking up there a little bit. We may have a little connection issue here. Okay, in this case, let's wait for Rosamond to come back, and maybe some of the questions, some other questions that have come up in the chat. So there's a question here by Jolly Samoa. What has been the experience like in the 3 countries when it comes to interagencies, ministries sharing of data? And how can we improve intergovernmental cooperation and data sharing? Malaki, would you like to start on this?
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Thank you also for the question. I think I've already touched a little bit on this in the importance of setting clear policies and also clear protocols for sharing data, especially within governments. I do recognize that there are sensitive information that sometimes we are not able to share openly, given the sensitivity of some of that information. But if there are clear policies highlighting what information is available and can be shared and how to access these, then I think we do not have any problems. This is definitely the case with Samoa, with the, for example, the vital information provided by LIDA, and also the climate and weather data and water resources and hydrological data. As long as with current policies, as long as the government is clear on the use and who will be accessing these, then we are fine to share that information. That's definitely how we can improve data sharing. And we also do recognize that for some agencies, cost recovery is very important, especially with the information and the amount of costs that go and resources that go towards collecting some of that information. But at the same time, governments are open to sharing so that we're able to further our research and also work with partners to improve climate resilience works. So that's just one method that I believe can resolve some of those issues.
Okay, thank you, Malaki. Catalina, would you like to come in here on the question of working across different ministries and sectors and data sharing and involving stakeholders?
Yeah, thank you. So this is a very important and relevant question, as um, I'm hearing from the statements from the speakers and my colleagues in terms of data collection and data sharing. In the Marshall Islands, we are also having those experience in how it's really difficult to sharing the data, as the other colleague just mentioned. Now there are some data that are for only certain folks that should be provided these data for, but you know we got to find a way to make it work. So in the Republic of the Marshall Islands, we have what we call the EPSO, or the office that is responsible for collection of statistics. But still, as I mentioned, we're having difficulties trying to share it with interagencies. So we have decided to develop a committee. It's called Tilio or TTEC. That it's an interagency committee that looks at climate change and disaster risk and management. And so one of the goal of this committee is to see if they can find a way to then make data sharing readily available when the planning needs to be made or decisions need to be made. So I am happy that Charlie has brought up this question, and surely we will need also some inputs from the other participant years. What are their experience, and have they made it work? And if they can share it with other Pacific Island nations, we would really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, a very important question, and certainly something that we will come back to in the duration of the peer learning sessions. There's another really interesting question here, both to Catalino and Malaki. Are there any examples where young people have been involved in activities for disaster mitigation and resilience in Samoa and the Republic of the Marshall Islands? Malaki, can we start with you?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a very important question, and I honestly believe that everyone has a place and has a role when it comes to any environmental and as well as disaster mitigation resilience works. So I cannot provide specific examples from our disaster management office, but from our water resources division, we have been engaged with young youth groups and also young leaders. Not necessarily in terms of very technical research, but we're just next week, we'll be launching a Upland Watershed Young Leaders Program. And this looks at engaging young people in terms of protecting upland forest areas as a form of soft measure in preventing flash flooding. So this in itself is a role that we're hoping the young people will provide in promoting our messages that our upland forest areas are our natural water tanks and should remain forested in order to mitigate as well as try and improve flood water going into the ground so that we don't face a lot of flash flooding that we're seeing at the moment. So that is a very recent example that I can provide in how we're working with young people. Thank you.
Catalino, are there any examples from the Marshall Islands you would like to talk about?
Yes, very much. I would like to share. So there's this uh, organization for young kids here in the Marshall Islands. It's called Chojukum, means your place. That they're really involved at the grassroots level in the fight in terms of saving our environment. And so given this opportunity, I'd like to give a shout out to the kids, because this is the key. They're the key to tomorrow is their future. And so we're really seeing them fighting for what we're all discussing here about saving our islands from uh, the effect of climate change, like sea level rise and all of that. So I think this is key to have the kids involved, to have the students involved in the planning. So as I mentioned, the TTEC committee, or Tilio, uh, uh, was thinking about involving the kids in having their voice in the plan. So in the coming months, there will be some sessions with high school kids around the country to get their input as the government is developing the national adaptation plan. But again, I'd like to reiterate that the kids are the key to us succeeding in developing what we need to develop to survive in the next 50 or 100 years. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent note on which to end this panel discussion. Thank you so much to our panelists. And unfortunately, we have lost Rosamund due to communication issues, but we've heard from her. I think it's been a really rich and lively discussion. We'll come back to some of these questions, certainly in the events to come. And I think it's been really interesting to hear from three such different perspectives in terms of the scope, of the objectives of the assessment, of the hazard and risk context, of course, as well. A clear climate change adaptation focus really in the Marshall Islands to inform a national adaptation plan. So very much at the upstream level, but also with a clear sense of urgency that informs this work. And then from Tonga, we've heard about the social focus on spatial planning, the need to gather risk information in order to inform urban resilience and climate change adaptation of the capital. And finally, but last but not least, from Samoa, this urgency to develop a system that can protect communities in Apia from a very significant risk of flash flooding, and the work that was needed to create the type of information that communities can quickly receive and act upon to protect themselves and their livelihoods. So thank you so much. I think there's common threads here in terms of some takeaways, really, and it was really laid out by Dr. Mataki, and we've come and dug into some of these issues further on. I think one is the step between the assessment, between the knowledge and using assessment results, which involves the whole issue of communicating results in an understandable and clear manner to stakeholders and to communities. Finally, what we've also touched upon was really all the capacity issues in terms of monitoring and analyzing risk, but also translating findings into both policy recommendations, but then also action. So again, something that we will explore further in our webinar series. And last but not least, the important and really crucial role of communities and capturing community experience and understanding of resilience, so that these findings really make sense to them and can be acted upon, as well as at a different level, some of the challenges remaining in sharing data across agencies. In terms of our next events, so before we close, let me just briefly highlight that we have 3 following events. One will very much focus on giving you an overview of regional Pacific disaster risk knowledge, as well as talking about recent assessments and some of the innovations that we're seeing. Secondly, we're talking about applications in terms of applications to climate change adaptation, disaster risk management, ranging from preparedness to more longer-term risk reduction efforts. And finally, we're talking about something that we've talked about already quite a bit today, which is strengthening collaboration between different actors and reaching out to communities. This series, as we mentioned in the beginning, is really for the potential users of risk information. So staff from Pacific government agencies and other potential users in civil society, in the private sector. And if you're interested, please apply. There's a link on the ADB website. And there's a link also, I'm sure, that can be put into the chat box to link up and to apply for this series. So we have about 50 seats that we can distribute, and all participants will receive a certificate at the end of these 3, or if you count this one as well, for events. As I said, this event has been recorded and will be accessible as well. So thank you so much for staying until the end. I wish you a very productive and good day, and see you hopefully, at least some of you, another time. Thank you.